In 1910, a priest in Lyon received a letter he'd not asked for and could not trace to any sender. It told him, in polite and careful language, that certain questions had been raised about his theological views. No names were given, no specific works were cited, no process was explained. Within 6 months, a book he'd spent 4 years writing was blocked from publication by his diocese without explanation. He was never formally charged with anything. He was never given a hearing. He simply discovered, through the accumulation of small closed doors, that someone somewhere was watching him and had decided he was dangerous. He was not alone. Across France, Belgium, and Germany, in the years between 1909 and 1921, dozens of Catholic priests, theologians, and bishops found themselves subject to the same invisible pressure. Careers stalling, appointments reversed, manuscripts refused, always without formal charges, always without the possibility of appeal, because the people doing this were not operating through any official channel of the Church. They were operating through a secret network that reported directly to the Pope and answered to no one else. The network was called the Sodalitium Pianum, and it was the Vatican's own internal spy service, built not to watch foreign governments or protect the Pope's physical safety, but to find and neutralize anyone inside the Church itself who was thinking the wrong thoughts. This is the story of how that network was built, who built it, why the most powerful religious institution on earth decided it needed one, and what it tells us about the Church that existed before, during, and after it. Because the Sodalitium Pianum was officially dissolved in 1921, but the questions it raises about power, loyalty, secrecy, and the control of thought inside a hierarchical institution did not dissolve with it. Some of them are still being asked today. To understand what the Sodalitium Pianum was and why it existed, you first have to understand what the Catholic Church of 1909 was afraid of. And the answer, which sounds strange from the outside but was entirely serious to the people living it, was ideas, not armies, not governments, not the kind of threats that require soldiers to defeat. The Church had survived those for centuries. What terrified the senior leadership of the Vatican in the first decade of the 20th century was a movement of thought taking place inside Catholic universities, inside seminary classrooms, inside the editorial offices of Catholic journals, among men who were entirely loyal to the Church and who believed they were helping it. The movement had a name. It was called modernism. In the Catholic context of that era, modernism did not mean what the word means in ordinary conversation. It was not simply about being up to date or progressive in a general sense. It referred to a specific set of intellectual positions that Catholic theologians and biblical scholars had been developing over the preceding decades in response to the great intellectual upheavals of the 19th century. Darwin had published his theory of evolution in 1859. German scholars had been applying historical and critical methods to biblical texts, with results that challenged traditional assumptions about authorship and dating. Philosophers across Europe were questioning the classical foundations of religious certainty in ways that could not simply be ignored by anyone who took serious scholarship seriously. The modernist theologians, and they were a genuine movement, however loosely organized, believed the Church needed to engage with all of this honestly, rather than simply condemning it. Men like Alfred Lozi in France and George Tyrrell in England argued that the development of doctrine was real, that the Church's understanding of its own teaching had evolved over time and would continue to evolve, and that this was not a crisis but simply how living institutions worked. They were not trying to destroy the Church. Most of them loved the Church. They were trying to help it survive in a world that was changing faster than its official positions were allowed to acknowledge. Pope Pius X, who took office in 1903, saw none of this as helpful. He saw it as infiltration, as sabotage conducted in the language of scholarship. In 1907, he issued an encyclical called Pascendi Dominici Gregis, which in translation means feeding the Lord's flock, and it described modernism in language that has no equivalent in modern institutional communication. It called modernism the synthesis of all heresies, not one heresy, not several heresies. The synthesis, the concentrated distillation, of every error Christianity had ever faced in 2,000 years of existence. This was not a careful theological response. It was a declaration of war. And in the same year, the Vatican issued a decree called Lamentabili Sane, which condemned 65 specific propositions associated with modernist thought, covering everything from the nature of biblical inspiration to the development of doctrine to the historical foundations of the sacraments. Every Catholic priest in the world was required to take what became known as the anti-modernist oath, a formal sworn declaration rejecting the central claims of modernist theology. This oath was not abolished until 1967. For 60 years, every man ordained to the Catholic priesthood, every seminary professor, every bishop at his consecration swore it. But an oath is only as effective as the enforcement mechanism behind it. And this is where a man named Umberto Benigni comes into the story. And once he enters the story changes completely. Benigni was born in Perugia, in central Italy in 1855. He became a priest and spent his early career working in Catholic journalism and ecclesiastical administration. By the time Pius X became Pope, Benigni had worked his way into the Vatican Secretariat of State, the department that handles the Holy See's diplomatic and administrative affairs. He occupied a relatively minor official position, Under-Secretary for a section dealing with press and communications. But his real significance lay in something no organizational chart would ever reflect. He had spent years building a network. It was a network of correspondents, informants, and like-minded priests and laymen spread across Catholic Europe, men who shared his conviction that the modernist threat was real and that the Church's official response was nowhere near aggressive enough. He had contacts in Catholic journalism in Paris, Liège, Munich, and Vienna. He had sources inside seminaries and universities. He had relationships with men who moved in the same circles as bishops and cardinals, and who could report quietly and reliably on what those bishops and cardinals were actually thinking. Benigni was not a theologian. He was not a scholar. What he was, with a clarity that is almost frightening in retrospect, was an intelligence operator. Someone who understood that in a bureaucratic institution, information is power, and that the person who controls the flow of information controls everything downstream of it. In 1909, with what the later documentary records strongly suggest was the personal authorization of Pope Pius X, Benigni formalized his network into a structured organization. He called it the Sodalitium Pianum. The Latin means, roughly, the Brotherhood of Pius, a name that anchored the organization's identity directly to the reigning pope. Members were given an internal code name, sapinière, a French word for a stand of pine trees, which sounds innocuous enough that it could appear in correspondence without raising questions. Internal communications were conducted in French, the dominant language of Catholic intellectual culture at the time, and the primary language of the Church's most important battleground. since it was in France that the conflict between Catholic traditionalism and Catholic intellectual modernity was being fought most openly and most bitterly. The structure was simple. Bernini sat at the centre. Around him was a small inner circle of trusted collaborators, mostly based in Rome but some scattered across Europe. Below them, or rather extending outward from them, was a much larger and more diffuse network of correspondents and informants, whose numbers are difficult to establish precisely because the organisation operated in deliberate secrecy and did not keep membership rolls of the kind that historians prefer to find. What the surviving correspondence shows is a network that reached into France, Belgium, Germany, Switzerland, Austria and beyond, into the chanceries and seminaries and editorial offices and drawing rooms where the Catholic intellectual life of early 20th century Europe was conducted. The function of this network was intelligence gathering. Specifically, the gathering of intelligence about individuals within the Church who were suspected of modernist sympathies. Bernini's agents, if that is not too dramatic a word for them, though it may not be dramatic enough, attended lectures. They read journals. They monitored correspondence where they could gain access to it. They cultivated relationships with people close to the individuals they were watching. And the information they gathered was organised into dossiers, systematic files on individual priests, theologians, seminary rectors, and bishops, recording what they had written and said, who they associated with, what positions they had taken in internal church debates, and what their suspected theological views were. These dossiers were then used. That is the word that matters most in the whole story. They were not simply gathered and filed, they were used. The information in them was communicated through channels that were never entirely transparent, to bishops who were making appointments, to Vatican officials who were deciding which manuscripts would receive the approval needed for Catholic publication, to members of the Holy Office, which was the Vatican's doctrinal oversight body, and according to the most significant historical assessments of the period, directly to the Pope himself. Careers were derailed on the basis of information whose source the subject could not know. Publications were blocked. Transfers to undesirable postings were arranged. Men were quietly informed that their prospects had changed without being told why, because if they had been told why, they might have been able to respond, and the point was that they should not be able to respond. I want to be specific about what this meant in practice, because I think the abstraction of organisational history can smooth over the human reality of what was actually happening. A priest who had devoted his life to serious theological scholarship, who had taught in a Catholic university for 20 years, who had published work that was careful and learned and conducted in genuine good faith, could find himself, without warning, without formal charge, without any process of the kind that even the most basic standards of justice would require, effectively finished. His next book blocked. His candidacy for a senior position quietly closed. His reputation in the network of Catholic academic life carefully and invisibly damaged by reports he would never be allowed to see, produced by people he might never be able to identify. All of this conducted in the name of protecting the faith by men who believed, with what appears to have been complete sincerity, that they were doing exactly that. The case of Cardinal Desire Joseph Mercier illustrates how far the Sodalitium Pianum's reach extended, and how little respect it had for rank or standing. Mercier was Archbishop of Malines in Belgium, one of the most intellectually distinguished Catholic prelates in Europe, and a man who would later become an internationally celebrated figure for his moral leadership. during the German occupation of Belgium in the First World War. He was a serious philosopher who had founded the influential Catholic Institute at Louvain, and who had spent his career attempting to build a genuine synthesis between Thomistic philosophy and modern science. He was not a modernist in any reasonable definition of the term, but he was intellectually serious in ways that made Bernini's network nervous, and his name appears in Sodalitium Pianum correspondence in terms that are not complimentary. When even Mercier was being watched, the reach of the operation becomes clear. This was not a targeted surveillance of a handful of known radicals. It was a broad, ambient monitoring of Catholic intellectual life. We aimed at identifying anyone whose thinking deviated from what Bernini and his network had decided was acceptable. The international scope of the operation is one of the things that makes it historically significant beyond the specific damage it did to specific individuals. Bernini had correspondents in Paris who monitored the French Catholic press with remarkable thoroughness. He had agents in Belgian seminaries. He had contacts in Germany who track the Catholic academic establishment there. He had connections in Switzerland. He appears to have had reach into certain circles of the Austrian Church. The surviving correspondence, which was eventually compiled and studied by serious historians, gives a picture of an organization that was watching Catholic intellectual life across an entire continent with a consistency and a comprehensiveness that no official Vatican body was doing at that time. The French Church was the primary target for reasons that went beyond theology. France, in 1909, was a country where the relationship between the Catholic Church and the state had been in crisis for over a century. The Revolution of 1789 had stripped the Church of its traditional authority and property. The conflicts of the 19th century had repeatedly returned to the question of the Church's role in French public life. The law of 1905 had formally separated Church and state in France, removing the legal framework that had governed their relationship since Napoleon. French Catholic intellectuals were navigating a genuinely difficult situation, trying to maintain the intellectual credibility and social relevance of Catholicism in a culture that had largely moved past Catholic institutional authority, while the Vatican was simultaneously telling them that any serious engagement with modern thought was heresy. Bernini's network regarded the French Catholic intellectual world as simultaneously the most important and the most dangerous front in the battle against modernism. One of his most active French correspondents was a man who went by the internal code name Virgil. The use of code names throughout the organization's internal communications is worth pausing on. They borrowed them from classical antiquity, from history, from geography. Bernini himself used several, the most common being Monsignore Bernini, but also in some correspondence Romanus. The use of code names was not merely practical caution, though it was that. It was a statement of self-understanding. These men saw themselves as operating in a tradition of secret networks, conducting necessary work that the official structures of their institution could not openly acknowledge. Whether they modelled themselves consciously on the Jesuits, who had operated their own complex networks of information and influence across Europe for 3 centuries, or on secular intelligence services, or simply on the logic of conspiracy that has its own internal grammar regardless of the institution it inhabits, the result was the same. What an organization that had given itself permission to operate outside the normal rules because it believed the stakes were too high for normal rules to apply. The stakes, as Bernini and his allies understood them, were genuinely enormous. They were not wrong about the scale of what was happening. The intellectual challenge to traditional Catholic Christianity in the early 20th century was real and serious. Darwin had changed how educated people thought about human origins in ways that were not going to be undone by papal decree. The historical critical method applied to biblical texts had produced results that the Church's traditional account of Scripture could not comfortably absorb. The philosophical tradition descending from Kant had placed the foundations of religious certainty in a position that required serious intellectual engagement to defend. These were not trivial problems. The modernist theologians who were trying to engage with them were not enemies of the faith. But Bernini and the men around him were not capable of making that distinction, and the Pope who authorized their operation was not inclined to make it either. The result was an operation that treated genuine intellectual seriousness as treachery, and that used the apparatus of institutional power to punish men for thinking. In 1912, the existence of the Sodalitium Pianum became partially known to a broader circle when some of its correspondence was leaked. The details of how this happened are disputed in the historical record, but the consequences were significant. Cardinal Secretary of State Raphael Meri del Val, who had been one of the senior Vatican figures most closely associated with the anti-modernist campaign, was confronted with questions about the organization's existence and its methods. The Vatican's response was characteristic of institutions caught doing things they cannot comfortably defend. It acknowledged as little as possible and moved on. The operation continued. Bernini continued. The dossiers continued to be compiled, and the information continued to flow. The First World War changed the context in ways that Bernini and the Sodalitium Pianum were not well positioned to navigate. The war reshuffled the political alignments of Catholic Europe in ways that made the clean ideological map of anti-modernism harder to maintain. Bernini, whose political views had always combined his theological conservatism with a specific form of European nationalist and anti-democratic politics, began to move in directions that even some of his former Vatican allies found uncomfortable. His organization's correspondence began to reflect not just theological anti-modernism, but a broader reactionary politics that was increasingly difficult to distinguish from the nascent fascist and extreme nationalist movements that were beginning to organize in the post-war chaos of Europe. Pope Pius X died in August of 1914, 6 weeks after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and 2 days after Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Whatever private assessment he made of the organization he had authorized, he took it with him. His successor, Benedict XV, was a very different figure. Where Pius X had been a pastor with deep popular instincts and a fierce simple faith that made him impatient with nuance, Benedict XV was a diplomat, a man formed in the Vatican's foreign service who understood that the Church's interests in the world were not well served by the kind of aggressive internal policing that the Sodalitium Pianum represented. He had himself been the subject of Sodalitium Pianum surveillance before his election, a fact that gives his subsequent treatment of the organization a certain wry significance. Benedict did not shut the Sodalitium Pianum down immediately. That is not how institutions work, and it is not how the Vatican works in particular. The organization continued to operate for several years after his election, though with less direct papal support and less operational freedom than it had enjoyed under Pius X. Bernini's access to senior Vatican figures declined. His influence contracted. The flow of information from his network to the centres of Vatican decision-making thinned. He remained active, writing and publishing, building new connections, but the direct operational link between his network and the institutional machinery of the Church was quietly severed. The formal dissolution came in 1921. By that point, Bernini's political activities had become genuinely embarrassing for the Vatican. His connections to extreme right-wing political movements in France and Italy were well established. His involvement in the production and circulation of anti-Semitic material, which had been part of the broader reactionary political culture in which he moved since at least the 1910s, was documented. His organisation's files and correspondence had been obtained by Belgian intelligence services during the war, a fact that placed the Vatican in the awkward position of having its internal spy network's archives sitting in a foreign government's possession. The formal dissolution was handled in the manner that institutions most prefer for handling things they would rather not have happened. Quietly, without public statement, without acknowledgement of what the organisation had been or what it had done. Pope Benedict simply withdrew official recognition, and the Sodalitium Pianum ceased to exist as a formal entity. Bernini lived on until 1934. In his later years, he moved increasingly openly in the circles of Italian fascism, had connections to Mussolini's government, and continued to produce journalism in the tradition of Catholic reactionary anti-Semitic conspiracy, thinking that he had been developing since the 1910s. He died in Rome, unreconciled with his critics, apparently unrepentant about anything he had done, and was buried without the kind of public attention his decade of influence over the inner workings of the Catholic Church might have merited. The question of what the Sodalitium Pianum actually achieved, in the sense of whether it successfully suppressed modernism or merely harmed the individuals it targeted, is one that the historical record answers in a way that should be uncomfortable for anyone who authorized surveillance as a means of controlling thought. It did not suppress modernism. The intellectual developments the modernists were responding to did not stop developing. Darwin did not become less correct. Historical scholarship did not become less rigorous. The philosophical challenges to traditional religious epistemology did not become less serious. What the Sodalitium Pianum accomplished was the silencing for a period of roughly 2 decades of the most serious Catholic attempts to engage with those developments honestly. It drove underground or out of the church the men who might have helped the institution navigate the 20th century with greater intellectual credibility. It contributed to a culture of enforced conformity within Catholic theological scholarship that lasted well beyond its formal dissolution, and that would eventually produce its own crisis in the 1960s, when the Second Vatican Council was forced to reckon with decades of suppressed intellectual development all at once. The irony that I kept coming back to while researching this, and I want to share it because I think it is genuinely striking, is that the church that authorized the Sodalitium Pianum to protect orthodoxy against dangerous ideas produced, as a direct consequence of that suppression, a generation of Catholic thinkers who had no safe space in which to work through their questions, and who therefore either left the church entirely or carried their unresolved questions into positions of influence where they would eventually resurface with far greater force than if they had been allowed honest expression in the first place. The Second Vatican Council, which opened in 1962, and produced changes in Catholic teaching and practice that the men of the Sodalitium Pianum would have regarded as everything they feared, was staffed by theologians who had done their serious intellectual formation in the years immediately following the anti-modernist crisis. Men like Karl Rahner and Yves Congar and Hans Urs von Balthasar, who shaped the theological direction of Vatican II, Jesus den Stilam, had all operated in the shadow of the anti-modernist campaign and its apparatus. Congar in particular had been subject to official restrictions on his writing and teaching during the 1950s, restrictions imposed by the same logic, though by different formal mechanisms, as the Sodalitium Pianum's operations half a century earlier. He was later made a cardinal by John Paul II. The church that had surveilled him to protect itself from dangerous thinking eventually made him one of its princes. Bernini himself is an important figure to stay with for a moment longer, because his trajectory after the Sodalitium Pianum tells you something significant about the kind of political and intellectual world that produced the organisation in the first place. He was not simply a zealous churchman who went too far in defence of orthodoxy. He was a man whose theological conservatism was part of a broader worldview that included a specific and developed anti-Semitism, a hostility to liberal democracy that went well beyond theological concerns, and a vision of Catholic order that was essentially authoritarian in its structure. The network he built inside the church was in certain respects a rehearsal for the kind of political organisations that would emerge in European fascism in the 1920s and 30s. Not because fascism caused the Sodalitium Pianum or vice versa, but because they were drawing from the same intellectual and cultural well, the conviction that a besieged traditional order faced existential threats from forces of dissolution, and that those threats justified methods that normal times and normal standards would not permit. This is why the Sodalitium Pianum matters beyond the specific damage it did to specific careers. It is a case study in what happens when an institution decides that the threat it faces is serious enough to justify bypassing its own stated commitments to justice and transparency. The Catholic Church is an institution that teaches, as a matter of formal doctrine, that every human being possesses inherent dignity and has rights that cannot be simply overridden by institutional convenience. The Sodalitium Pianum operated in systematic violation of those principles within the institution that taught them. Yet this is not a paradox unique to the Catholic Church. It is a pattern that appears in virtually every institution that has ever decided, under pressure, that its survival requires it to act against its own values. Intelligence services do it. Governments do it. Corporations do it. Universities do it. The form varies. The logic is always the same. The stakes are too high for normal rules. The enemy is too serious for normal methods. We are the ones who understand what is really at risk here, and we will do what is necessary. The document trail of the Sodalitium Pianum survived in the archives of Belgian intelligence, where the wartime seizure of Bernini's correspondence had deposited it, and was eventually made available to historians. The Belgian historian Émile Poulain, who spent decades studying the anti-modernist crisis and its consequences, produced the most thorough scholarly analysis of the Sodalitium Pianum's operations in his 1969 book Intégrisme et Catholicisme intégral, a work that remains the foundational text for anyone who wants to understand what the organisation actually was and what it actually did, as opposed to what it said it was doing. Poulin's analysis established beyond serious dispute that the Sodalitium Pianum was a real operational intelligence network, that it reported to the highest levels of the Vatican, that its methods systematically violated the basic procedural rights of the individuals it targeted, and that its damage to Catholic intellectual life was both real and lasting. The Vatican's response to this historical assessment has followed a familiar pattern. The canonization of Pius X in 1954, which took place before Poulin's full analysis was published, but after the basic facts of the Sodalitium Pianum were available to anyone who looked for them, has remained a source of controversy among Catholic historians. A pope who authorized a secret network of informants to conduct surveillance of his own clergy, who used the information gathered by that network to damage the careers of men who were guilty of nothing more than taking ideas seriously, who presided over a regime of intellectual conformity enforced by methods borrowed from the intelligence services of secular governments, is a man whose sanctity requires a more careful accounting than his official biography typically provides. And the formal question of his responsibility for the Sodalitium Pianum has been answered in different ways by different historians. Some argue that his personal involvement was deep and direct, that he not only authorized the organization but received its reports and acted on them. Others argue that Bernini operated with a degree of entrepreneurial independence that went beyond what even Pius X had specifically sanctioned, and that the Pope's personal knowledge of the organization's methods was less complete than the most critical accounts suggest. The surviving documentary evidence does not resolve this question with the clarity that a definitive verdict would require. What it does show, without ambiguity, is that the operation could not have functioned as it did without papal authorization, that senior Vatican officials were aware of its existence and its methods, and that it continued under Pius X's pontificate without any recorded expression of concern from the Pope about how it was conducting itself. The Sodalitium Pianum was officially dissolved in 1921. But what was not dissolved, what could not be dissolved by any organizational decree, was the culture of suspicion and enforced conformity that it had helped create and that outlasted it by decades. Catholic theological scholarship in the 1920s, 30s and 40s operated in a climate in which intellectual caution was not just professionally prudent, but existentially necessary. Men who wanted to do serious theological work learned to do it carefully, to signal their orthodoxy clearly in every paragraph, to stay well inside boundaries whose precise location was never officially defined but whose existence was unmistakable. The theological creativity that was being suppressed during these decades did not disappear. It went underground. It continued in private correspondence, in seminar rooms where trust had been carefully established, in the footnotes of published works where the real argument was conducted in a language that only the fully initiated could follow, and then it came back. The Second Vatican Council, which Pope John XXIII called in 1962, and which produced the most significant changes in Catholic teaching and practice since the Council of Trent 4 centuries earlier, drew heavily on the intellectual work that the anti-modernist campaign had suppressed. The theologians who staffed it had done their formation during the years of suppression, and had emerged, those who remained, with both a deep knowledge of what has been forbidden and a fully developed sense of why the official position had been inadequate. The Council's declarations on religious freedom, on the Church's relationship to the modern world, on the nature of revelation and its development, on the relationship between Catholic Christianity and other religious traditions, addressed in measured institutional language precisely the questions that the Sodalitium Pianum had been devoted to preventing the Church from addressing at all. I am not a Catholic, and I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters for how you receive what I'm saying next. The Second Vatican Council's decisions are contested within the Church to this day. There are serious Catholics who regard the Council as a genuine act of the Holy Spirit, guiding the Church toward a better understanding of its own teaching. There are equally serious Catholics who regard it as a catastrophic departure from authentic tradition. I have no standing to adjudicate that argument. What I do think I have standing to say, as someone who spent a considerable amount of time reading the history of this period while making this video, is that the suppression of honest intellectual inquiry never actually suppresses the questions being asked. It only suppresses the asking of them in the open, where they might be answered carefully and with appropriate respect for both the questions and the tradition. What the Sodalitium Pianum accomplished was not the preservation of Catholic orthodoxy from the corrosion of modernist thought. What it accomplished was the storage of those questions under pressure until the pressure became too great to maintain. Suppressed questions do not disappear, they accumulate. The question of what exactly authorized Bernini's operation connects to a larger question about how institutions manage the relationship between their public commitments and their operational realities. The Sodalitium Pianum was not unique in using surveillance and informal pressure to manage dissent. The Vatican had a long tradition of such operations stretching back to the Roman Inquisition and its successor bodies. What was distinctive about Bernini's network was its specifically modern character, its use of the infrastructure of journalism and correspondence networks that the early 20th century had made available, its systematic organization of intelligence into usable dossiers, and its reach across international boundaries in ways that the older ecclesiastical censorship machinery had never achieved. It looked, in other words, not like a medieval inquisition, but like a modern intelligence service, which is what it was. The word that recurs most consistently in the historical literature about the Sodalitium Pianum is integrism, or in French, integralism. It refers to a specific strand of Catholic conservatism that insists on the total integration of all aspects of life under Catholic authority, the rejection of any separation between the religious and the secular, and the insistence that Catholic doctrine must govern not just personal spiritual life, but public institutions, law, science, and culture. Bernini was an integrist in this precise sense. His objection to modernism was not just that it got the theology wrong, it was that it conceded by its very method that there was a domain of secular scholarship operating by secular standards to which Catholic theology had to respond. The integrists regarded this concession as fatal. If Catholic theology had to meet Darwin on Darwin's ground, if biblical scholarship had to defend itself by the standards of historical critical scholarship rather than simply asserting the authority of the magisterium, then the battle was already half lost. The only acceptable position, as the integrists understood it, was the assertion of total Catholic authority over every domain of inquiry, enforced by mechanisms capable of making that assertion effective. The Sodalitium Pianum was one of those mechanisms. This is why Bernini's later trajectory toward fascism is not as surprising as it might initially seem. Fascism offered the integrists something the Vatican could not quite offer them, which was a political program for the total reorganization of society under authoritarian command, the elimination of the liberal institutions and liberal freedoms that made modernism possible, and the kind of emergency powers that would allow the authentic leaders of civilization to do what needed doing without being constrained by the procedural commitments that prevented them from doing it in normal times. Not every integrist became a fascist. Many remained within purely ecclesiastical politics and never made that transition. But the intellectual and temperamental continuity between integrism of the Benigni variety and the fascist political movements of the 1920s and 30s is real and has been documented by serious historians, most notably by Pula, but also by the American historian John Pollard, whose work on the Vatican in the fascist era is essential reading for anyone who wants to understand this period. The legacy of the Sodalitium Pianum is not limited to the specific damage it did or the careers it ended. Its most lasting legacy is what it reveals about the mechanisms by which a hierarchical institution can turn its own moral authority against itself. The Catholic Church teaches justice. It teaches the dignity of every human person. So it teaches the right of every accused person to know the charges against him and to have the opportunity to respond. The Sodalitium Pianum operated in systematic violation of every one of these principles, using the institutional authority of an institution that taught them to suppress the people who might have raised questions about whether they were being observed. This is not a contradiction that the Church has fully reckoned with. The canonization of Pius X stands, unrevised. The documents of the Sodalitium Pianum are accessible to scholars in the Belgian state archives and in some Vatican collections that have been opened. The story they tell has been told carefully and responsibly by professional historians, but the official account of the period and of the men who presided over it has not been substantially revised in response to what that scholarship has found. I think about this when I think about institutions more broadly, not just the Catholic Church, not just religious institutions. Any institution that has moral commitments built into its founding purpose, that defines itself by reference to values that constrain how it can act, faces the same temptation that the Vatican faced in 1909. The temptation to decide that this particular threat is serious enough that the values that normally constrain action have to be set aside, that the rules still apply in principle, but not right now, because right now is different. This reasoning is available to any institution at any moment of stress, and the history of institutions is largely the history of how they respond to it. Some refuse. Most, at some point, do not. The Sodalitium Pianum was officially dissolved in 1921. Umberto Benigni died in Rome in 1934. The Belgian state archives hold the correspondence of a spy network that operated inside the most powerful religious institution in the world for 12 years, watching priests filing reports, ending careers, and reporting to a pope who was later declared a saint. The files are there. The names are there. The reports are there. The letters in their careful French, moving between code names borrowed from classical antiquity, discussing the dangerous ideas of men who are trying to think honestly about their faith, are there. What is not there is any formal acknowledgement by the institution that authorized all of it, that the thing it authorized was wrong. What is not there is any list of the men whose careers were damaged by information they were never allowed to see, produced by people they were never allowed to confront, acted on by officials who were never required to explain themselves. What is not there is the apology that the Church that teaches justice and the dignity of every human person owes to the men the Sodalitium Pianum harmed. It has not been issued. The records are in Brussels. The silence is in Rome. And perhaps that is the most honest thing the story has to tell. Not that institutions with moral commitments are uniquely likely to betray those commitments, but that the betrayal, when it comes, intends to be so thoroughly explained in the institution's own terms, so fully authorized by the institution's own logic, so deeply embedded in what the institution genuinely believes about the stakes it faces, that it never quite rises to the level of acknowledged wrongdoing. It remains, as the Sodalitium Pianum remains in official Catholic history, a regrettable excess by men who meant well in difficult times, and not what it actually was, a spy service built inside a church that preaches mercy. run by a man who believed he was defending the truth, aimed at people whose only crime was thinking about what that truth might actually mean, and protected, for as long as it needed to be protected, by the quiet, efficient machinery of an institution that understood, even when it did not say so, that some things are better left without a formal accounting. Let someone else file that report. There is another dimension to this story that deserves its own space, which is what the Sodalitium Pianum tells us about the broader crisis of authority that the Catholic Church was navigating in the early 20th century. The anti-modernist campaign did not occur in a vacuum. It occurred in a church that had spent the preceding century losing ground in almost every direction it looked, and whose institutional responses to that loss had become increasingly defensive and increasingly disconnected from the reality of what was actually happening in the world it was trying to govern. The First Vatican Council of 1870 had defined the doctrine of papal infallibility, the teaching that when the Pope speaks in his formal capacity as teacher of the universal Church on matters of faith and morals, he speaks without error. This was not a new idea within Catholic theology. The concept had been debated for centuries, but its formal definition as dogma in 1870 was a specific response to a specific crisis. The Papal States, the territories in central Italy that the Pope had governed as a secular ruler for over 1,000 years, were in the process of being absorbed into the new unified Italian state. The Pope was losing temporal power. He would lose it entirely in 1870 when Italian troops entered Rome. The declaration of papal infallibility was in part, many historians have argued, a compensation for this loss, an assertion of absolute spiritual authority at precisely the moment when absolute temporal authority was being stripped away. The consequence of this assertion for the intellectual culture of the Church was significant. If the Pope speaks without error on matters of faith and morals, then the boundaries of what counts as settled Catholic teaching expanded dramatically. And if those boundaries expanded, then the range of what counted as impermissible deviation from those boundaries expanded with them. The anti-modernist campaign was in this respect a logical consequence of the doctrine defined at Vatican I, not in the narrow theological sense that papal infallibility required the suppression of modernism, but in the broader institutional sense that an institution that has asserted absolute doctrinal authority for itself will inevitably be drawn toward enforcing that authority against those who question it, and will be tempted to use whatever means are available to make that enforcement effective. Bernini understood this dynamic with the instinctive clarity of a man whose entire career had been built in the institutional church rather than in the academy. He was not operating from a theological position developed through years of scholarly reflection. He was operating from a bureaucratic intelligence, a sense of where institutional power lay and how to use it. And what that intelligence told him in 1908 and 1909 was that the institutional machinery of the Church was not being used to its full capacity to address the modernist threat, and that someone needed to build the supplementary machinery that the official structures could not quite produce, so he built it. The specific mechanics of how Bernini's network gathered its information are worth examining because they tell you something about the methods available to a private intelligence operation working inside a large institution before the technological surveillance tools that governments take for granted today even existed. There were no phone calls to intercept. There was no email. There was no digital trail. What there was, in the Catholic intellectual world of 1910, was correspondence, publications, lectures, and face-to-face conversation. And what Bernini's network built was a system for monitoring all four. Correspondence was the most valuable and also the most difficult to access. Some of it was obtained through informants who were themselves part of the networks that the targets were corresponding with, and who could share what they had read or summarize what had been discussed. Some of it was accessed through the normal channels of ecclesiastical oversight, since superiors had certain rights to review the correspondence of their subordinates. Publications were easier. Catholic journals and books were already subject to censorship through the imprimatur system, the requirement that Catholic publications receive official ecclesiastical approval before being issued. Bernini's network read everything published in the Catholic press with systematic attention, and the dossiers it built drew heavily on this reading. Lectures were covered by correspondents who attended them and reported on what had been said, with a reporter's ear for the phrase or argument that could be extracted from context and presented as evidence of dangerous thinking. Face-to-face conversation was covered through the cultivation of relationships with people who moved in the same circles as the individuals being watched. Someone who had dinner with a suspect theologian could report what had been discussed. Someone who attended the same academic conference could note which conversations had taken place and between whom. This is, stripped of its specifically Catholic context, standard intelligence tradecraft. The same methods were being used by the political police services of European governments to monitor their own dissidents and opponents. Bernini had clearly absorbed something of how those services worked, whether through direct contact or through the general cultural availability of the idea that information gathered systematically about private individuals could be organized and used to influence their fate. The Catholic context gave these methods a specific texture, because the information being gathered was not about political activity in the ordinary sense, but about theological opinion, about the direction of scholarly inquiry, about what a man privately believed and how that private belief was shaping what he wrote and taught. This made it, in some respects, a more intimate intrusion than ordinary political surveillance, and because it reached not just into what people did, but into what they thought. The career of one particular French theologian illustrates the human cost of this surveillance with unusual completeness. His name was Lucien Labothonière, and he was an Oratorian priest and philosopher who had been one of the leading figures in what was called Catholic modernism in France. He was not a biblical critic in the manner of Loisy. His work was primarily philosophical, concerned with the relationship between faith and reason, and with what he regarded as the excessively static and rationalistic character of the scholastic philosophy that the Church had officially endorsed since Leo XIII's encyclical of 1879 directing Catholic intellectual life back toward the thought of Thomas Aquinas. Labothonière believed that scholasticism, whatever its historical merits, had reduced Christian faith to a set of intellectual propositions divorced from the living, existential experience that he believed faith actually was. This was a serious philosophical position, with a respectable intellectual lineage, and it was developed in books and articles of genuine rigour. In 1913, all of Labothonière's books were placed on the index of forbidden books. Not one of them. All of them. Everything he had published. This was not a targeted condemnation of a specific error in a specific work. It was a total institutional silencing, and it was not the end. For the remaining 32 years of his life, until his death in 1932, Labothonière was forbidden by his ecclesiastical superiors from publishing anything, though he continued to write, producing manuscripts that circulated privately among trusted colleagues, manuscripts that were published only after his death. He spent 3 decades as a thinker who could think but was not allowed to speak, who could write but was not allowed to be read. The Sodalitium Pianum's contribution to his case was the monitoring and reporting that helped sustain the institutional pressure on him through the years when it might otherwise have relaxed. The Belgian front of Bernini's operation had its own specific character and its own specific targets. The Catholic University of Louvain, founded in 1425 and refounded in 1834, was one of the most important Catholic intellectual institutions in the world. It had been the centre of Cardinal Mercier's philosophical work and was home to a community of theologians and historians who were among the most intellectually serious in European Catholicism. It was also a place where the engagement between Catholic thought and modern scholarship was taken seriously, which made it, in Bernini's assessment, a significant risk. The Sodalitium Pianum's correspondence includes references to Louvain figures that are not complementary, and the university's broader intellectual culture was regarded by Bernini's network as insufficiently vigilant about the boundaries between acceptable Catholic scholarship and dangerous modernist contamination. The German Catholic intellectual world presented a somewhat different challenge. The German Catholic theology had its own tradition of engagement with modern philosophy that went back at least to the early 19th century, and the theologians of the Tübingen school, who had developed sophisticated responses to the philosophical and historical challenges of their era. By the time of the anti-modernist campaign, German Catholic scholarship was producing work that engaged seriously with the historical critical method and with the philosophical tradition descending from Kant while attempting to maintain theological orthodoxy. Bernini's network had fewer agents in German Catholic circles than in French and Belgian ones, partly because of language barriers and partly because the institutional structure of the German Church, with its stronger tradition of episcopal independence, then made the kind of centralized reporting that fed Bernini's operation more difficult to organize. But the anti-modernist campaign in Germany was real, and had real institutional consequences, including the formal censuring of several German theologians whose work was regarded in Rome as insufficiently orthodox. The First World War brought the Sodalitium Pianum's period of greatest influence to an end not by directly exposing it, but by changing the political and ecclesiastical landscape in which it operated. The war reshuffled the alliances and antagonisms of Catholic Europe in ways that the simple ideological map of anti-modernism could not accommodate. Catholics of every theological stripe found themselves on the same side of national conflicts regardless of their theological positions. The moral authority that figures like Cardinal Mercier acquired through their resistance to the German occupation in Belgium was not the kind of authority that could be quietly damaged by reports from Bernini's correspondence. The war made certain kinds of ecclesiastical small politics look small in a way that they had not looked before. Pope Benedict XV's election in September of 1914, just over a month after Pius X's death, marked the beginning of the Sodalitium Pianum's decline. Benedict was a man who had spent his career in the Vatican's diplomatic service, who had served as Archbishop of Bologna, and who understood the Church's interests in a broader and more flexible way than his predecessor. His first encyclical, Ad Beatissimi, issued in November of 1914, contained a clear and deliberate signal. He warned against Catholics who gave nicknames to other Catholics, as a way of marking them as suspect or unorthodox, a practice he described as divisive and unchristian. The people who understood the reference, and there were many of them in the Catholic world of 1914, understood it perfectly. Benedict was not going to continue the anti-modernist campaign in the way that Pius X had conducted it. This did not mean he approved of modernism or was indifferent to doctrinal orthodoxy. He was not. What it meant was that he judged the methods being used to enforce orthodoxy as more damaging to the Church than the ideas those methods were aimed at suppressing, and thus he was prepared to say so, carefully and indirectly, in language that gave him deniability while making his meaning clear to those who needed to understand it. This is itself a revealing picture of how the Vatican manages internal policy disputes. Nothing is directly said. No one is formally charged. No decree is issued condemning the practices of the Sodalitium Pianum. The Pope sends signals in encyclical language, and the institution reads those signals and adjusts, and the adjustment is deniable from every direction, because nothing was ever quite stated clearly enough to require a denial. The seizure of the Sodalitium Pianum's correspondence by Belgian intelligence services during the war was, for the Vatican, a genuine embarrassment of the kind that is not easily managed. The Belgian government had captured documents that showed in considerable detail how an organisation operating under papal authorisation had conducted surveillance of Catholic clergy across Europe. The documents were not immediately published, but their existence was known, and the knowledge that they existed and that their contents could be released at any politically inconvenient moment gave the Vatican good institutional reasons for wanting to put some distance between itself and the organisation they described. This is not the most elevated motivation for reforming institutional behaviour, but it is a real one, and it appears to have been part of the context in which the Sodalitium Pianum was eventually dissolved. The historian's task in assessing the Sodalitium Pianum is complicated by the fact that the Vatican has never fully opened its archives for this period to unrestricted scholarly access. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, which holds the records of the Holy See's activities, has been progressively open to scholars over the decades, and the pontificate of Pius X is covered by archival releases that have allowed serious historical work on the anti-modernist campaign. But the specific files relating to the Sodalitium Pianums, reporting to Vatican officials, including any direct communications with the Pope, remain incompletely available. Much of what historians know about the organisation's operations comes from the Belgian archives, from the private archives of individuals who were involved with it, and from the published scholarship that has worked systematically through these sources. The picture that emerges is clear enough in its essential outlines, but the complete picture of exactly what the Pope knew, when he knew it, and how directly he was involved in directing the organisation's activities is not yet fully established. This matters for the question of Pius X's canonisation in a way that the Church has not engaged with as seriously as it should. Canonisation is the Church's formal declaration that a person is in heaven and can be proposed to the faithful as a model of Christian life. It requires, in the contemporary process, a careful examination of the candidate's life and virtues. The examination of Pius X's cause for canonisation was conducted and concluded before the full scholarship on the Sodalitium Pianum was available, and the question of whether the evidence that subsequently became available would have affected the outcome of that process is one that Catholic scholars have raised, but that the institutional Church has not chosen to address formally. The canonisation stands, the scholarship stands, and the relationship between them is managed, as so many uncomfortable relationships are managed within institutions, through the simple expedient of declining to acknowledge that there is a relationship at all. I want to end where every serious treatment of the anti-modernist crisis eventually ends, which is with the question of what was actually at stake. Not in the institutional terms that Bernini understood it, not in the theological terms that the modernist theologians understood it, but in the broader human terms that the story opens onto when you step back far enough from the details. The Catholic Church in 1909 was an institution of roughly 260 million members, by the best estimates of the period, spread across every continent and every culture on Earth. It was the largest religious institution in human history. It had an intellectual tradition extending back 2,000 years that had produced, among other things, the universities of medieval Europe, the preservation of classical learning through the dark centuries after Rome's fall, the systematic philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, the artistic heritage of the Renaissance, and the missionary networks that had carried Christianity to the Americas, Africa, and Asia. It was also, by 1909, an institution that was being rapidly overtaken by a world it had not fully reckoned with. The Industrial Revolution had transformed the economic and social structure of European life in ways that the Church's traditional pastoral and intellectual frameworks were not well equipped to address. The secular state had replaced the confessional state across most of Western Europe. The natural sciences had established their methodological independence from theological authority in ways that could not be reversed. And the intellectual tradition that the Church had spent centuries building was being asked, by some of its most serious practitioners, is to engage honestly with all of this rather than simply condemning it from a position of institutional authority that was itself under challenge. The men who built the Sodalitium Pianum thought they were defending that institution against forces that would destroy it. They were wrong, not because the challenges were not real, but because the methods they chose to address those challenges accelerated the very damage they were trying to prevent. An institution that responds to intellectual challenge by silencing the challengers does not thereby answer the challenge. It merely postpones the reckoning while adding to its eventual cost. The Sodalitium Pianum postponed the reckoning. Vatican II was part of the bill, and the ongoing crisis of authority within the Church, the continuing conflicts between those who regard Vatican II as having gone too far and those who regard it as not having gone nearly far enough, is a further instalment of the same account, still being paid, still not fully settled, more than a century after a Belgian priest in Lyon opened a letter he had not asked for and discovered that someone, somewhere, had decided he was dangerous. The files are in Brussels. Read them if you want to know what an institution looks like when it decides that thinking is a threat it cannot afford to permit. And then look around at the institutions you live inside and consider whether any of them have made, or might make, or are making right now the same calculation.